You take that gas, Arthur Collins said, holding out the red plastic can with both hands. And you get to that hospital. You hear me? You get there. The biker stared at him, a man wearing a Hells Angels patch, 6 feet 2 inches of road and scar tissue, and he looked at this 62-year-old janitor like he'd never seen anything human before. Old man, that's your last can. I know what it is, Arthur said. Go. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Arthur's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Arthur Collins had exactly $412 in his bank account the night everything changed. He knew that number the way a man knows the sound of his own cough intimately without having to check. He checked it that morning on the cracked screen of his phone while sitting in the parking lot of Cesar Chavez High School, eating half a sandwich he'd wrapped in a paper towel the night before because the other half was for Evan. 14 years old and already built quiet, already learned not to ask for things. That boy had his grandmother's eyes and his mother's silence. And Arthur carried both of those facts like stones in his chest every single day. He'd worked the overnight shift that Thursday. 7 hours of pushing a mop through hallways that smelled like floor wax and teenager, and the particular kind of loneliness that lives inside an empty school after dark. He'd cleaned 3 boys' restrooms, unclogged a drain in the gymnasium, replaced 2 fluorescent bulbs in the science wing on a ladder that wobbled every time he shifted his weight, and hand-scrubbed the grout along the cafeteria floor on his knees. Because Harold Graves, the building supervisor, a man who wore short-sleeved dress shirts year-round and spoke to Arthur the way you speak to a machine that keeps almost breaking, had put it on the task sheet with 2 asterisks and the word tonight underlined. Harold Graves had a way of scheduling things that made it clear he understood exactly how little leverage Arthur had. Arthur had worked for the Bakersfield Unified School District for 11 years. He knew where every breaker box was in every building on that campus. He knew which hallway doors stuck in winter and which ones swung too hard in summer and hit the wall. He knew the name of the custodial supervisor before Graves, a decent man named Earl, who used to leave coffee in the break room and say, "Thank you," when the pot was done right. Earl had retired 4 years ago. Harold Graves had appeared in his place like something that grows in the absence of warmth. Arthur clocked out at 2:47 in the morning. He sat in his truck for a moment, a 1998 Ford F-150, the color of old rust with a crack running the full width of the windshield, and a heater that worked only on the highest setting, which made a sound like a cat being squeezed. He turned the key and listened to the engine turn over with that small hesitation it had developed over the last month. He made a note in the back of his mind, the way he'd been making notes for years, that he needed to look at the starter. He knew he wouldn't have the money to look at the starter. He filed the note anyway. In the bed of the truck, bungee corded to the sidewall, was a 5-gallon red plastic fuel can. It held 1.5 gallons, maybe slightly more. He'd filled it 10 days ago from the pump at the Shell station on White Lane when he'd had a little extra after cashing his check because the truck's fuel gauge had stopped working 2 winters back. And he'd learned to keep a backup after the one time he'd run dry on morning drive and had to clear his throat, walk 4 miles in the rain to get to work because he couldn't afford to miss a shift and couldn't afford a tow. That can was not a backup anymore. That can was the gas in his tank. He pulled out of the school lot and onto the empty street, heading for Highway 155. It was the longer way home, but it bypassed the stretch of road construction on Old River that had been adding 40 minutes to his route for 3 weeks. And at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, with his body feeling like it had been put through something agricultural, he wanted the fastest way to his bed. Evan would be asleep. He always left the kitchen light on for Arthur. Never said why, just did it. Arthur always turned off and stood in the dark for a moment before going to his room. And something about that small exchange, the light left on the light turned off, felt like the most honest conversation they had most days. He'd been on 155 for about 12 minutes when he saw it. There's a particular quality to something broken down on a desert highway at 3 o'clock in the morning. The way a vehicle sits differently when it's dead rather than just parked. Something about the angle, the stillness, the quality of defeat in the shape of it. Arthur's eyes caught it before his brain processed it. A dark mass on the right shoulder. And then the headlight beams swept across chrome and black paint and a Harley-Davidson fat boy with the kind of presence that a motorcycle only has when it's been lived on. And beside it, a man Arthur's foot came off the gas before he made any conscious decision. Just instinct. His body responding the way it had been responding to broken down things his whole life from the time he was 8 years old. And his father taught him to stop on the road for anyone stranded because you never know who they are, and you always know who you are. Then his brain caught up. The man was big, not just tall, physically large in a way that read as categorical rather than individual. The kind of large that suggested years of not backing away from things. He was wearing a leather vest over a dark shirt despite the temperature, which had dropped into the low 40s. And even from inside the truck cab, even in the sweep of headlights at 40 miles per hour, Arthur could see the back of that vest. He knew what those patches meant. Everybody in Bakersfield knew what those patches meant. His foot went back to the gas. The truck rolled forward. He was past the man, past the bike. He watched the scene shrink in his rearview mirror, and he told himself what anyone would have told themselves. You don't know that man. You don't know what happened to that bike, or how it happened, or who else might be involved. You have a grandson at home. You have $412. You have exactly 1 and 12 gallons of fuel between yourself and total immobility. And you cannot afford in any sense of that word to stop. He told himself all of that. He was about 150 foot past the man when he stopped the truck. He sat there with the engine idling and the heater screaming on high, and he looked at the rearview mirror, and he thought about his wife. Margaret Collins had died 14 months ago in Bakersfield Memorial Hospital. A stroke. She'd been 59 years old, and she'd looked in the last years like a woman who had carried more than her share without complaint and was finally running out of the grace to keep doing it. She had been Arthur's entire moral architecture. Not his religion, not his philosophy, the specific way she thought about people. The way she would stop what she was doing when someone was talking to her and actually look at them. Clear as throat, not waiting for her turn to speak, but genuinely absorbing what they said. The way she had once told Arthur during a bad stretch when they couldn't make run, and their daughter was in her second rehab, and everything felt like it was dissolving. Nobody makes it through the dark alone, Arthur. Nobody. And you can't always see who's going to need you until you're right next to them. He thought about that. He thought about the size of that man on the shoulder of 155. He thought about how the man was standing, not waving, not pacing, not using his phone, just standing with his hand resting on the seat of the bike like he was saying goodbye to something. Arthur put the truck in reverse. He pulled up behind the Harley with his hazards on and sat for a moment with the door locked. Then he turned on the cab light so the man could see his face through the windshield, because that was the thing his father had taught him too. When you stop for someone, let them see you're not a threat before you open the door. Let them adjust to the fact of you. He opened the door. The cold hit him immediately. Desert cold is a specific kind of cold. It doesn't creep. It arrives. The man turned. Up close, he was everything the silhouette had promised. Heavy set and scarred in the way of a life that had involved a great deal of physical consequence. Somewhere in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and reset by someone who hadn't been too concerned with exact alignment. His eyes, though, his eyes were something Arthur hadn't expected. They were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. You came back, the man said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't accusation. It was just the observation of a man who had stopped being surprised by much. I drove past, Arthur said. Shouldn't have. The man looked at him for a long moment. You know who we are, he said. One hand moved slightly toward the patch on his vest. Not threatening, just indicating, making sure Arthur understood what he was looking at. I know the patch, Arthur said. And you came back anyway. My wife used to say something came back to me driving away. Arthur put his hands in his jacket pockets. What's wrong with the bike? The man was quiet for a second, then fuel line. It cracked about 3 miles back. Been running on whatever was left in the line itself. Ran dry about a/4 mile before I stopped. I think he paused. I got a guy who can fix it. I got people I can call, but my phone's at 4% battery, and he stopped. Something moved across his face. I need to get somewhere tonight. It's not about the bike. Where do you need to get? Bakersfield Memorial. Arthur went very still. Someone's hurt, he said. My brother. The man's voice didn't break. It was clear he had made a decision not to let it break, and he was holding that decision with both hands. Car accident 2 hours ago. They called me. I was an hour out. I turned around and rode straight back. And now I'm standing on the side of a highway. And he stopped again. His jaw tightened. He's in surgery. They said I should be there in case. In case. Arthur understood that phrase. He understood it the way you only understand things you've already lived. He got a call once 14 months ago, and a voice on the other end had said the words, "You should come now." And he had been 23 minutes away, and he had driven those 23 minutes telling himself, it would be fine. It would be fine. She had been healthy. She had just had a stroke. People survive strokes. She would be fine. He'd been 3 minutes too late. 3 minutes. He'd walked into that room, and Margaret was already gone, and the nurse was saying something kind, and none of it registered because he was stuck on the mathematics of it. 23 minutes plus 3 minutes. 26 minutes total. If he had left 5 minutes earlier, if he had taken the other route, if he had not stopped to put on his jacket, he looked at this man on the side of the highway. This big scarred man in Hell's Angels vest who was holding himself together with pure will, and whose phone was at 4%, and whose brother was in surgery. "What's your name?" Arthur asked. "Mike. Mike Rohr." "Arthur Collins." He walked around to the bed of his truck. He unclipped the bungee cord on the fuel can. "I got 1.5 gallons, maybe a little more. I don't know if that gets you there and back, but it'll get you there." Mike Rohr walked over and looked at the can, and then looked at Arthur. "That's your spare." "That's my tank," Arthur said. Mike went quiet. Really quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't comfortable, but isn't hostile either. The kind that means a man is recalibrating something. "How far you live from here?" Mike asked. 7 miles, give or take. "You pour that gas in my bike." "How do you get home?" "I'll figure it out." That's not an answer. It's the only one I got right now. Arthur held out the can. "You take that gas, and you get to that hospital. You hear me? You get there." Mike stared at him. He reached into his cut and pulled out a folded stack of bills. He peeled off 300s and held them out. Arthur didn't take them. "Man," Mike said, "take the money." "I don't need your money. You just told me that's your only gas." "I know what I told you." Arthur kept the can extended. "My wife died in that hospital. I was 23 minutes away, and I was 3 minutes late, and he stopped. Started over. Take the gas. Get to your brother. That's all." Mike Rohr looked at Arthur Collins for a long time. Then he took the can. He poured every drop into the Harley. Arthur watched him do it, and neither of them spoke. The sound of fuel going into the tank was quiet and final. And somehow it sounded like a decision that couldn't be taken back, which it was. When the can was empty, Mike handed it back. His jaw was working. Something in his face was trying to find the correct arrangement for what he was feeling, and not finding it. "I'm Iron Mike," he said. "President 350 member, Chapter California." He said it the way you state facts that have weight. "I don't forget things." "You don't need to remember anything," Arthur said. "Just drive safe." Mike stood there another second. He looked like he wanted to say something else. Then he put on his helmet, mounted the Harley, and kicked it to life. The engine's sound was enormous on the empty highway. He pulled out onto the road, and Arthur watched his tail light diminish in the distance until it was a red pinpoint, and then nothing. The highway was completely silent. Arthur stood in the cold next to his empty truck with the empty fuel can in his hand, and he thought about what he'd just done, and he thought it was probably the right thing. And he thought it was probably also going to hurt very badly very soon. He got back in the truck. He sat with the heat running. He calculated 7 miles on foot in 40 degrees desert cold in the work boots he'd been on his feet in for 7 hours. He had no phone charger in the truck, so calling anyone wasn't an option, and he didn't have anyone to call at 3 o'clock in the morning anyway. He had a flashlight in the glove box. He had half a bottle of water. He had his jacket. He started walking. The first mile was all right. His body still had the heat of the truck cab in it, and the motion kept him warm enough. He kept to the shoulder flashlight on watching for headlights so he could move to the edge of the gravel. One car passed him in the first mile. It didn't slow down. The second mile was when his left knee started. Arthur had been managing a torn meniscus for 2 years, managing it the way a man manages something he can't afford to fix, which is to say with ibuprofen in silence and the careful distribution of weight. Walking on cold desert gravel in the hours before dawn woke that knee up with a clarity that was almost impressive. He kept walking. He thought about Evan. He thought about his daughter Dana, who was somewhere in Los Angeles, and who he hadn't spoken to in 8 months, and whose face he saw in Evan's face every morning, the good parts of her face before everything had happened. He thought about Harold Graves and the task sheet and the asterisks and the word tonight underlined, and he wondered if his shift had already been noted in whatever system Harold used, and whether being an hour late clocking out mattered, or whether the work had been done, the grout had been scrubbed. The fact of completion was in the record. He thought about Margaret. He talked to her while he walked the way he'd been talking to her since the hospital room, since those 3 minutes. He told her what he'd done. He said, "I hope that was the right thing." And because he'd been married to her for 31 years, and he knew her voice in his memory the way he knew his own, he heard her say, "You already know if it was right, Arthur." You knew before you turned the truck around. He got home at 6:17 in the morning. Evan was asleep. The kitchen light was on. Arthur turned it off. He sat down at the kitchen table in the dark. He pulled off his boots and looked at his hands and thought about the fuel can empty sitting in the bed of the truck on the shoulder of 155. His phone buzzed a voicemail. Missed call at 5:48 a.m. from a number with a 661 area code he didn't recognize. He pressed play. Mr. Collins. Harold Graves' voice. Not angry, worse than angry flat. The voice of a man who's already made a decision and is just completing a procedural step. This is Harold Graves. You were scheduled through 7 a.m. tonight, this morning, and as of 5:30, you have not responded to 2 previous calls and your assignment log shows incomplete sign-off. District policy requires notification for any absence exceeding 2 hours. Since no notification was received, and since this is your second attendance incident in the fiscal year, I'm placing you on administrative termination pending review. You'll receive written notice by mail within 72 hours. Return your badge to the district office at your earliest convenience. Arthur held the phone in his hands for a long time. He set it on the table. He sat in the dark kitchen of his leaking trailer, and he listened to the sound of Evan breathing down the hall, and he thought about $412 in a truck sitting dead on Highway 155, and a snorts man riding through the dark toward a hospital toward his brother toward the chance that Arthur had never had. He put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. He didn't have the strength left for it. He just sat in the particular silence of someone who has given everything they had, and is now sitting in the empty space where everything used to be. Somewhere across Bakersfield, a Harley-Davidson engine was cutting through the pre-dawn air, eating up the miles toward Bakersfield Memorial, carrying a man named Iron Mike Roar toward the last chance he had to tell his brother something important. Arthur didn't know that. He didn't know anything except the dark and the cold coming in under the trailer door, and the sound of his grandson sleeping, and the crushing arithmetic of what comes next when next is all you have left. Arthur didn't sleep. He tried. He lay down on top of the covers with his boots off, and his jacket still on, and he stared at the ceiling of his bedroom and listened to the trailer settle and creak the way it always did in the cold hours before sunrise. And his mind refused to stop moving. It kept running the same loop. The voicemail, Harold Graves' flat procedural voice, the phrase administrative termination pending review, snorts, which was the kind of language designed to sound like a process when it was really just a door closing. He'd been 34 minutes late, 34 minutes after 11 years. He got up at 7:15 because lying down had stopped being rest and had started being just another form of suffering. He put water on for instant coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at his phone. The missed call from Graves was still on the screen. He hadn't deleted it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because deleting it would mean accepting it, and he wasn't there yet. Evan came out of his room at 7:40. He was still in his sleep clothes, an oversized gray sweatshirt and basketball shorts he had had since 6th grade. He looked at Arthur the way he always looked at him in the morning, that quiet measuring look, and said, "You didn't sleep." "I slept a little." Evan went to the cabinet and got a bowl. He got the cereal. He sat down at the table. He said without looking up, "Your truck's not outside." Arthur wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "No, it's not." Evan poured the cereal. He poured the milk. He set the jug back, and then he looked up. "What happened?" Arthur told him. Not all of it. He told him the truck had run out of fuel on 155, and he'd had to walk home, and he'd be figuring out the truck situation today. He did not tell him about the voicemail. He was not going to tell a 14-year-old boy at 7:40 in the morning that the thing keeping their lives minimally functional had just been removed. Evan was quiet through this. Then he said, "Did you give your gas to someone?" Arthur looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "Because you always do stuff like that." He said it without any particular emotion, like he was stating a characteristic of the weather. "And because the can would have been in the bed, and you would have used it before you walked 7 miles. Arthur looked at his grandson for a moment. At 14, Evan had developed this quality of perception that was occasionally startling, this ability to see around corners that Arthur was still learning to navigate himself. There was a man, Arthur said, on the highway. His bike was dead, and his brother was in the hospital. Evan nodded. He ate his cereal. After a moment, he said, "Was the brother okay?" "I don't know." Evan nodded again. He didn't say anything else about it. He finished his breakfast, put his bowl in the sink, and went to get ready for school. At the door, he stopped and looked back. "Grandpa." He waited until Arthur looked at him. "You did the right thing." Then he went down the hall. Arthur stood at the counter for a long time after that. The school bus came at 8:10. Arthur watched it from the window. He watched Evan get on backpack over one shoulder, moving with the careful economy of a boy who had learned early not to make himself too visible in public spaces. Arthur thought about that. He thought about what kind of life he was building for this kid. What kind of stability, and the word stability sent him back to the voicemail, and he picked up his phone and called the district office. He got a receptionist. He asked for Harold Graves. He was put on hold for 4 minutes, which felt intentional, and then Harold Graves picked up. "Mr. Collins, I'm calling about the voicemail." "Yes." A pause that managed to convey both acknowledgement and complete indifference, as I indicated district policy, is clear on. "I was on the highway. Arthur said I had a situation. My truck ran out of fuel. I didn't have my charger. I walked home." He kept his voice even. He'd practiced even. "I've worked here 11 years, Harold. 11 years without a major incident. There was a written warning in March," Graves said, "for the equipment storage violation." Arthur closed his eyes. The equipment storage violation had been a mop left in the wrong closet because he'd had to respond to a flood in the gymnasium and hadn't had time to replace it, and had logged the deviation in the task record, which Harold had apparently noted without acknowledging the context. "That was a procedural, Mr. Collins." Harold's voice did not change temperature. It lived in one temperature, which was the temperature of a room nobody particularly wanted to be in. "The decision has been made, and it's under administrative review. If you'd like to submit a written appeal, the form is on the district website under Human Resources. The deadline for appeal is 10 business days from the date of notification." Harold Arthur stopped, took a breath. "I have a grandson. He's 14. I have this job is what I have." A pause. "I understand this is difficult. The process exists for a reason." The line was quiet for a moment. "Will you at least note that I called?" Arthur said for the record that I called the morning after and explained. "I'll note the call," Harold Graves said, and then because he was the kind of man who ended conversations rather than completed them. "Good luck, Mr. Collins." The line went dead. Arthur set the phone down on the counter. He stood there in this kitchen of his trailer, the remains of his coffee gone cold, and his knee aching from the walk, and the particular emptiness of a man who has just been told by a process that he is not a person, but an incident. He thought about the appeal form on the district website. He thought about 10 business days. He thought about the $412 and the truck on the highway, and whether the truck had been towed yet, and the tow fee, and whether he could get a loan against his next paycheck. And then he remembered there might not be a next paycheck. He got his jacket. He started walking. The impound lot was on the other side of Bakersfield. It took him an hour and 20 minutes on foot and 2 bus transfers. And the bus required exact change, which he had barely because he found quarters in his jacket pocket from a laundry run he hadn't done yet. He got to the impound lot at 11 o'clock in the morning and stood at the window, and the man behind the counter told him the fee was $220. "Kiss your card." Arthur had $412. "Is there a payment plan?" he asked. The man looked at him over his glasses in a way that said the answer was no, but he was going to make Arthur hear it out loud. "Storage fees acre-wed at $22 per day," the man said. "And no, we don't offer payment plans. It's full payment at release." Arthur nodded. "If I can get the money together, daily fees start today," the man said, not unkind exactly, just done with the conversation. Arthur walked out of the impound lot and stood on the sidewalk and did the math. $220 today, $242 tomorrow. He had no income coming, no savings to speak of a truck he couldn't get out, and a job he no longer had. He had a 14-year-old boy at home who had looked at him this morning and said, "You did the right thing." He sat down on a bus bench. He didn't panic. This was something people always assumed about Arthur, that situations like this one would break him open, produce visible crisis. They didn't. He'd been living close enough to the edge long enough that crisis had a familiar texture. What he felt instead was a kind of terrible clarity. The clarity of a man who can see exactly how things are and has no illusions about them. He needed money. He had no immediate source of money. He had skills, maintenance, mechanical work. He'd been fixing things his whole adult life, but skills without tools and without a truck were a different kind of useless. He had 11 years of work history at the district. He had an appeal he could file in 10 business days that probably wouldn't change anything, because Harold Graves was the kind of man who made decisions that stuck. Not because he was powerful, but because no one above him cared enough to override him. He rode the bus home. He was at the kitchen table trying to work out a budget on the back of an envelope. A genuinely brutal exercise when the left side of the equation is 0. When his phone rang, he didn't recognize the number. He almost didn't answer. Spam callers had been relentless lately, the kind that offered him car warranty extensions for a car that barely ran. But something made him pick up. Maybe it was the same instinct that had made him put the truck in reverse on Highway 155. Some part of him that was still operating below the level of logic, still making decisions the rest of him hadn't caught up to. Is this Arthur Collins? A man's voice, low, deliberate, not spam call. Who's asking? My name is Danny Roar. I'm Mike's brother. A pause. Mike Roar. He said you another pause longer. I'm sorry. They just moved me out of ICU this morning, and my hands aren't totally working right yet with the phone. So, excuse me if I'm Arthur straightened in his chair. How are you doing? I'm alive. The voice cracked on the word alive in a way that made clear the man understood exactly what that word was worth right now. The doctor said if Mike had been another 40 minutes, he stopped. He was there when I came out of surgery. He was just there, and he told me about you. Arthur didn't say anything. He told me about the highway, about your bomb. He said you knew about Danny's stop again. He said you knew about being late to a hospital. He didn't need to tell you all that. Arthur said quietly. He needed to tell someone, Danny said. I think he needed to say out loud, so it was real because I've known Mike my whole life, and I've never heard him sound like that. Like he was trying to figure out who you were. I'm nobody special, Arthur said. You gave a stranger your last gas in the middle of the night. Danny's voice steadied. Mike said you wouldn't take the money. That's right. Why? Arthur thought about it. Because it wasn't a transaction, he said finally. It was just the right thing in the moment. The only thing that made sense. The line was quiet. Arthur could hear hospital sounds in the background. The PA system distant. The ordinary noise of a place that deals in life and its alternatives. Mike wants to talk to you. Danny said he's been at this hospital since 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's not leaving until he does. But he didn't want to call you himself yet. He asked me to call first. He said a short sound that might have been a laugh. He said he didn't know how to start the conversation. Iron Mike doesn't know how to start a conversation. Iron Mike, Danny said, cried in the parking lot of this hospital at 4 in the morning. First time I've seen that since our mother's funeral. He paused. He'll call you probably today. I wanted to say thank you myself before he does because you don't know me and you saved my brother's life, and you deserve to hear it from me directly. Arthur sat at his kitchen table with the budget envelope in front of him, and his cold coffee, and the $4.12 he knew by heart, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not relief, not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Something that sat in the space that Margaret used to occupy, and felt briefly less empty. Tell your brother there's no debt, Arthur said. Tell him that. He won't believe you. Tell him anyway. Danny Roar said goodbye. Arthur set the phone down. He looked at the envelope with the numbers on it. Then he set it face down because looking at it wasn't helping anything. The call from Mike came at 4:17 that afternoon. No introduction, no preamble. Mike Rowe's voice came through the phone like gravel and low frequency, and the first thing he said was, "Talk to me about the job." Arthur blinked. What? Danny told me some of it. I filled in the rest. You walked 7 miles because you gave me your fuel. You missed your clock out. They fired you. A pause. Not a gentle pause. A pause with mass. Tell me about the job. It's handled, Arthur said, which was not technically true. It's not handled, Mike said. You're a man with a 14-year-old grandson and no truck and no paycheck. That is the opposite of handled. Mike, I'm not asking to fix it, Mike said. I'm asking to understand it. There's a difference. Just tell me. So Arthur told him. He told him about Harold Graves and the 11 years and the equipment violation that had been noted without context in the voicemail at 5:48 in the morning. He told him about the impound lot and the $220 fee and the $22 a day. He told him about Evan. He told him most of it not because he wanted help, but because Mike Rover asked the way that made it clear he was actually listening, not waiting, not constructing a response, just taking in what was there. When Arthur finished, Mike was quiet for a moment. The truck said impound on Commerce, Mike said. How did you only impound in that part of Bakersfield that picks up from 155? A pause. I know this city. The truck needs to stay there until I figure out the truck won't be there much longer. Mike said it was not a threat. It was information stated with the calm of a man who has already made a decision and is now simply sharing the outcome with someone else. Mike. Arthur's voice firmed. I told you no debt. I don't want. This isn't about what you want. The voice hadn't changed temperature, but it had changed weight. You know what we're about, right? The patch. You know what people think. I know what people think. Most of it's not wrong, Mike said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, But there's a thing that's true about us that doesn't make the news because it doesn't fit the story people want to tell. We take care of people who take care of others. That's not charity. That's not a transaction either. That's who we, clears throat, are. He paused. You took care of me when you had nothing. That means something to me personally. To my chapter. Your chapter doesn't know me. They do now. Mike said. Arthur went still. What did you tell them? Everything. Mike said, last night I walked into the clubhouse at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I stood up, and I told him everything. The highway, the gas, your wife, the hospital. His voice dropped a fraction. I told them about the 3 minutes. Arthur's throat tightened. Mike, 350 men heard that story, Mike said, and I'm going to tell you what the room sounded like when I finished. He paused. It sounded like the inside of a church. The line was quiet. Arthur realized his hand was gripping the phone hard enough that his fingers ached. He loosened them. What does that mean? He said. Practically, it means we're having a conversation at the next church meeting, Mike said, using the club's term for a formal meeting without irony. About you, about what's right. Another pause. I want you to sit tight until you hear from me again. Can you do that? I have a grocery situation that won't wait forever. Arrest, Mike said. Mike Arthur, a beat address. Arthur gave it to him. He gave it the way you give something to a current you've decided to stop fighting, because fighting it was taking energy he didn't have, and the current didn't seem like it was going to move him somewhere worse than where he already was. Someone will be there tomorrow. Mike said, don't be scared. I'm not scared, Arthur said. No, Mike said. I don't think you are. Something in the voice shifted. Not softened exactly, but altered. Like a man adjusting his grip on something he's been holding tight for a long time. You know what my brother said when I told him about you? He said, that's the kind of man I want to be when I'm 62. He's 38, clears throat, years old. A pause. I thought you should know that. Arthur didn't respond right away. He sat in his kitchen with the late afternoon coming through the window, and the budget envelope face down on the table, and the number $412 sitting in the back of his mind like a stone. Tell him he's got time to work on it, Arthur said finally. Mike made a sound that was close to a laugh, low and real and entirely unexpected. I'll tell him then. Thank you, Arthur. For real. The call ended. Arthur set the phone on the table and looked at the ceiling and thought about what he just set in motion, or more accurately, what he'd set in motion 11 hours ago on a dark highway when he put his truck in reverse, and how it kept moving outward in directions he hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. Evan came home at 3:30. Arthur hadn't told him about the morning, about the impound lot, or the bus transfers, or the budget envelope. He'd made sandwiches. There was still bread, still some turkey in the back of the fridge, and they'd eaten and talked about school. And Arthur had listened to Evan describe a situation with a kid in his English class who kept taking credit for group work. And Arthur had said what his father would have said, document everything, and say nothing until it matters. Evan had looked at him and said, that's actually smart. After dinner, Arthur sat on the edge of his bed in the quiet. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the way she'd held his hand in the years when things had been hard and never told him it would definitely get better because she was not a woman who trafficked in false comfort only in presence. She just held on. That was her thing. Just hold on. He thought about 350 men in a room that had it sounded like the inside of a church. He thought about Iron Mike's voice when he'd said, you gave me your last gallon. He thought about Danny Roar saying, I'm alive in that cracked wondering way like the words still surprised him. Outside, a truck went past on the road. Then another. Then it was quiet again. Arthur Collins lay down on his bed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he closed his eyes without running the numbers. He slept. He slept 8 hours straight. Arthur couldn't remember the last time that had happened. He woke up disoriented, thinking for a half second that he'd overslept a shift, and then the fell weight of the previous 2 days landed on him in sequence. The highway, the gas, the walk, the voicemail, the impound lot, the call from Danny, the call from Mike, and he lay there and let it settle. Outside, he could hear the neighbor's dog in a car with a loose exhaust in the ordinary sounds of a Friday morning on a street where people got up early because they had to. Evan had already left for school. There was a note on the kitchen table written in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting, made you coffee. There's eggs if you want them. Arthur sat down and drank the coffee and thought about the kind of boy who makes coffee for his grandfather before school and leaves a note and signs it with just his initial like their colleagues. He thought about what that boy deserved. Not luxury, not anything abstract, just stability, just the ordinary architecture of a life that didn't require constant crisis management just to stay in place. He'd been sitting there 20 minutes when the sound started. It was low at first, a rumble at the edge of hearing, the kind you feel in your sternum before your ears fully register it. Arthur had lived near enough to Highway 99 that he knew the sound of truck traffic, knew the sound of road noise in its various forms. This wasn't that. This was rhythmic, and it was getting louder, and it was coming from the direction of his street. He stood up from the table. Through the window, he watched a motorcycle turn onto his block. Then another, then 4 more behind that. Then a group of 8 riding 2 abreast, and then more behind them. And the sound had built from a rumble to something that vibrated the glass in the window frames and brought his neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, out onto her porch in her house coat to look. Arthur walked to his front door and opened it. The motorcycles filled his street end to end. He couldn't count them. He stood on his small front step and watched them roll to stop, engines cutting one by one, the sound dying back in waves until the block was quiet in a way that felt different from regular quiet. Fuller somehow charged. Men got off bikes, not boys. Men in their 40s and 50s, mostly some older, some younger, all wearing the same cut, the same patch, white background, red letters, and at the front walking towards him from a Harley that had clearly been ridden hard and recently Mike roar. In daylight, Arthur could see him more completely than he'd been able to on the highway. The broken nose reset at a slight angle, the gray at his temples spreading into the short hair above his ears. The eyes that were still carrying that particular exhaustion, though something else had come into them overnight, something that looked in the way these things look on men who don't show it easily, like purpose. Behind Mike, 2 steps back, was a man Arthur didn't know, slightly younger, still moving carefully, one arm in a partial brace. He was walking like someone who had been given permission to leave a hospital bed ahead of schedule, and had taken it immediately. Danny Roar looked like his brother in the way that second siblings often do, similar raw material differently processed by life. He was lighter in the jaw, less scarred, but he had Mike's eyes. And right now, those eyes were fixed on Arthur with an expression that Arthur didn't know how to categorize because nobody had ever looked at him quite that way before. Mike stopped at the base of the steps. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Arthur said. "I told you someone would come by." "You said someone. You didn't say everyone." The corner of Mike's mouth moved. "Danny wanted to come." Clear as throat. Once Danny was coming, I was coming. Once I was coming, he glanced back at the street full of motorcycles. It got complicated. Arthur looked past him at the men on the street. Some of them were talking quietly. Some were just standing. Several of them were looking at Arthur with an attention that wasn't threatening, but was absolutely direct, the way men look at something they've decided matters. "You told them about me," Arthur said. "I did." "Why?" Mike climbed the 2 steps until he was on the same level as Arthur, and he said it plainly. "Because you needed to be known by people who remember." He paused. "We remember things. It's important to us. You did something that needed to be in the record." Arthur looked at him. "Mike, I poured gas in your bike. You poured your last gas in my bike at 3 o'clock in the morning in the desert when you were already broke and already exhausted. And you did it because you knew what it cost to miss that call." Mike's voice was level, but the level was deliberate, like he was controlling something underneath it. "That's not a small thing. That doesn't get to be a small thing just because you want it to be." Danny had come up behind his brother. Up close, he looked worse than Arthur had expected, and better than he probably had any right to. There were bruises along his jaw that were going yellow at the edges. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had been told exactly which motions to avoid. "You're Arthur," he said. "That's right." Danny put out his hand, his right hand, the one not in the brace. "I practiced what I was going to say in the car," he said. "I had a whole thing." He shook Arthur's hand with a grip that was firm despite everything. "And now I'm standing here, and I don't have any of it." "You already said it on the phone," Arthur told him. "You don't need to say it again." Danny nodded. He held Arthur's hand a beat longer than a normal handshake. And then he let go and stepped back and seemed to need a moment. And Mike gave him that moment without comment, which told Arthur everything about the 2 of them. "We need to talk," Mike said. "Inside, if that's all right." Arthur stepped back and opened the door wider. Mike and Danny came in. A third man followed, late 40s, built like a former linebacker, gone mostly to deliberate maintenance with a shaved head, and a name Arthur would learn, was Victor Reyes, the chapter sergeant-at-arms. Victor nodded at Arthur and said nothing, and sat down at the kitchen table like a man who took up space without apology, but also without aggression. It was a particular skill. Mike stood. He looked around the kitchen in a way that wasn't intrusive, but wasn't casual either. The kind of look clears throat, that takes inventory, without commenting on what it finds. Coffee? Arthur asked. Please, Mike said. Arthur put on more coffee. He had enough for 3 cups if he was careful about it. He was careful about it. Danny sat across from Victor. Mike stayed standing. The truck's out of impound, Mike said once Arthur had set the cups down. Arthur turned from the counter. What? Last night, 2 of my guys went and got it. He said it the way you say something you've already processed and moved past. It's at our shop. We've got a full mechanical on it going this morning. Mike. Arthur's voice came out harder than he intended. I told you. You told me no debt. Mike said, I remember. He met Arthur's eyes. This isn't about debt. The debt conversation was you giving me fuel. That's already done. This is a different conversation. What conversation is it? Mike pulled out a chair and sat down. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward slightly. The conversation where I ask you what you need, and you tell me the truth instead of telling me it's fine when it's not. The kitchen was quiet. Victor was looking at his coffee. Danny was looking at the table. Arthur stood at the counter. He thought about the appeal form on the district website. He thought about $22 per day. He thought about the budget envelope face down on the counter next to the stove. I need my job back, he said. Or a job, something steady, benefits if possible. My grandson is 14, and he's never had real health care, and his last dental visit was. He stopped. I need the truck to run. I need to stay in this trailer through the end of the lease, which is 8 months. I need Evan to be able to finish this school year without moving. He paused. That's what I need. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Victor said to Mike without looking up from his coffee. Told you. Mike looked at Arthur. You said all of that without me having to pull it out piece by piece. Most people take 20 minutes to say half that much. I'm 62 years old. Arthur said, I know what I need. Mike nodded. He seemed to be turning something over. The employment situation. Tell me more about the supervisor. Graves. Harold Graves. He's been there 4 years. I don't think he's a bad person. I think he's the kind of person who follows rules because rules are simpler than judgment. You're more generous than I'd be. Mike said, I've had 11 years of practice. Does he have authority to reinstate you? Arthur considered this. He's the one who fired me. I don't know if reinstatement goes through him or above him. Who's above him? The district facilities director. Woman named Patricia Albright. Mike looked at Victor. Something passed between them that Arthur couldn't fully read, but understood the shape of the shorthand of men who have worked together long enough to communicate in compression. We have a few people who sit on the school board, Mike said. Not members, people who know us, people we've helped with things over the years. He held up a hand before Arthur could respond. Nobody's going to threaten anybody. Nobody's going to show up at somebody's office. That's not what I'm saying. He paused. I'm saying there are people who owe us a phone call, and a phone call to the right person asking the right question about a wrongful termination situation is not a threat. It's a conversation. Arthur was quiet for a moment. You have contacts on the school board. We do work in this community, Mike said. Toy drives, veterans assistance. We fixed the roof on a community center in O'Dale last spring. People know us in ways that aren't always the ways they expect to know us. It was the second time Mike had said something that adjusted Arthur's internal map of what he was looking at. Not erased what he knew, just expanded it. What do you want from me? Arthur asked directly, because men don't do things like this without wanting something. Mike didn't flinch. Fair question. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Nothing from you specifically. What I want is for the story to be right. You understand what I mean by that? The story. He looked at Arthur steadily. My brother is alive. You're the reason. The story of that needs to end correctly. If it ends with you losing your job and your truck and struggling to keep your grandson in school, the story's wrong. And I can't let the story be wrong. That's not a practical answer, Arthur said. Okay, Mike said, practical answer. There's a shop on Baker Street, auto repair. We own the building. The mechanic who ran it retired 8 months ago, and we haven't replaced him. We've been running it on a part-timer 2 days a week, and it's half what it should be. He looked at Arthur. You know engines. I know enough. You kept a 98 F-150 running past 200,000 miles. How do you know the mileage? My guys looked at it when they pulled it. Victor said this without inflection. The position, Mike said, is shop manager. Full-time benefits. Salary we can talk about, but it's fair. You'd have 2 mechanics under you. Experienced guys. The part-timer becomes full-time, and we hire 1 more. He paused. You don't have to answer today. Arthur looked at him. What's the catch? Mike almost smiled. You actually have to run the shop. I mean, beyond that, that's no catch, Mike said. You're not joining anything. You're not owing anything. You work. You get paid. You take care of your grandson. The shop runs right. That's the whole agreement. Arthur sat down at the table. He sat across from Mike Rohr, and he looked at this man he met 48 hours ago on a dark stretch of highway, and he tried to find the angle, the thing underneath the offer that would make it not what it appeared to be, and he couldn't find it. That made him more nervous than if he'd found something. I need to think about it, he said. Take your time, Mike said within reason. The corner of his mouth moved again. The shop doesn't run itself. Danny laughed. It was the first full sound that had come from him since he'd sat down, and it was a real laugh unguarded, and it changed the whole texture of the room. They sat in Arthur's kitchen and drank coffee and talked for another 40 minutes. Not about the offer, not about logistics. They'd moved past that for now. They talked the way people sometimes talk when they've landed in an unexpected place together and are figuring out what it means. Mike talked about Danny's accident, a drunk driver on the 99 completely unprovoked. The kind of random violence that had no narrative logic to it, just a man who should not have been driving, and was... Danny talked about waking up in the ICU, and the first thing he'd seen being Mike's face, and how Mike had tried to look like he wasn't terrified, and had completely failed. And Mike did not deny this. Arthur told them about Margaret. He told them more than he'd told anyone in a long time, more than he'd meant to. He told them about her voice and the way she thought about strangers and the phrase she'd used, nobody makes it through the dark alone. He told them about the 3 minutes. The kitchen was quiet when he said that. Victor, who had not said more than 4 words in entire conversation, put down his coffee cup and said, "My wife's been trying to get me to visit her sister in Fresno for 6 months. I've been putting it off." He looked at the cup. "I'm going to stop putting it off." Nobody commented on this. It just sat there in the room with them, which was exactly the right way to treat it. After Mike and Victor stepped outside to deal with something on the street, some question from one of the men that required a conversation Arthur, clear's throat, didn't need to be part of. Danny sat alone with Arthur for a moment at the kitchen table. He said, "He doesn't do this." Arthur looked at him. "Mike, this isn't a thing he does." Danny turned his coffee cup in his good hand. "He's not a hard man in the way people think, but he's a careful one. He doesn't make offers like this without thinking them through completely. He's been thinking about this since the highway." He paused. "He came to the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he sat in a chair outside my room, and he didn't sleep. And somewhere in those hours, he worked this out. I don't know all of it, but what he's offering you is real. I want you to know that." "I know it's real," Arthur said. "You're still scared of it." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I'm scared of needing it," he said. "There's a difference." Danny looked at him for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally. "There is." Mike came back in. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at Arthur with that direct, unhurried look. "One more thing," he said. "All right, the district. I'm going to make a call today, not to threaten anyone, not to make anyone's life difficult, just to make sure the right person is aware that a good man lost his job over a procedural issue while he was being a decent human being." He held Arthur's eyes. "You okay with that?" Arthur thought about Harold Graves' voice on the voicemail. The flatness of it, the process. "Make the call," he said. Something in Mike's face settled like something had clicked into alignment. "Good one," he said. "Now come outside. There are 140 men on your street who know your name, and you should know some of theirs." Arthur looked at him. "Not 350. Rest are coming Saturday," Mike said. "We couldn't all get here this morning. Some of them have jobs." Arthur stood up from the table. He thought briefly and completely about the man he'd been 2 days ago. The man with $412 in a dying truck and a task sheet with "tonight" underlined and 11 years of careful, quiet, invisible labor behind him. He thought about how invisible he'd been, how completely, effectively invisible. He walked to the door and opened it. The street was full of men who knew his name. His neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, was still on her porch. She looked at Arthur, and then at the street, and then back at Arthur with an expression that combined alarm and fascination in equal measure. And she called over, "Arthur, what in the world?" "It's all right, Elena," he said. "Are you sure?" He looked out at the street, at the men and the bikes and the morning light, and the whole impossible reality of the last 48 hours assembled in front of his trailer on a Friday morning in Bakersfield, California. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Mike stood beside him on the step. "The shop offer," Arthur said quietly. "The salary you said was fair." "It's fair," Mike said. "How fair?" $6,000 a month to start. More once you've got it running the way it should be. Arthur absorbed this. $6,000 a month was more than double what he'd been making at the district. It was health care. It was Evan's dental appointment. It was 8 months of lease payments and a truck that ran and something left over for the first time in longer than he could track. It was the thing Margaret had always believed was out there, that the math could work. That if you kept doing right, eventually the math could work. I'll need to see the shop. Arthur said this afternoon. Mike said, I'll need to meet the mechanics today, and I want to talk to Evan before I decide anything. He's 14. His opinion matters. Mike looked at him with something that was not quite surprise, but was in the neighborhood of it. Yeah, he said. All right. He seemed to be adjusting something in his understanding of Arthur. He's a good kid. He's the best person I know, Arthur said simply. Mike nodded. He didn't say anything to that. He just nodded the way you nodded. Something that is exactly what it should be. Day she would be. And on the street in front of the trailer, 140 men who had ridden in from across Kern County on a Friday morning because one of their own had told them a story about a janitor and a gas can in a dark stretch of highway. Those men stood with their bikes and their coffee thermoses and their quiet, unhurried attention, and they waited. The shop was called Rohr and Sons Auto, though there were no sons. Mike had explained this on the drive over with the particular brevity of a man who had made peace with something and didn't need to narrate the peace. The original owner had been his father, Thomas Rohr, who had built the business from a single-bay operation in 1979 and run it until a heart attack at 71 had made the decision for him. Mike had kept the name. He said it without sentiment, just fact. But Arthur heard everything underneath it. Victor drove them. Mike sat in the passenger seat. Arthur sat in the back and watched Bakersfield go past and thought about fathers and names and the things men keep after they're gone. The shop was on the corner of Baker and 22nd. 3 bays, lifts that looked newer than the building itself. A parts room that Arthur could tell from the doorway had been organized by someone who understood systems and then gradually abandoned by someone who didn't. A small office with a window that looked out into the main bay so the manager could watch the floor. A waiting area with 4 chairs and a coffee machine that blinked the wrong time. Arthur walked through it slowly. He didn't perform interest. He was actually interested in the difference showed. He crouched next to a brake lathe and looked at the calibration markings. He opened the parts room and stood in the doorway and looked at the shelving situation. He found the bay drain that was running slow from the build-up ring around the cover and noted it without saying anything. He checked the air compressor pressure and found it running slightly high. Mike watched him do all of this without comment. The part-timer was there, a young man named Cody, 26 years old, with the kind of natural mechanical aptitude that hadn't yet been matched by patience. Arthur could see it in the way he'd left a torque wrench balanced on the edge of a cart instead of hanging it. Good hands developing judgment. Cody, Arthur said. The young man looked up from a car. He was under. Yeah, that torque wrench is going to fall and either break or hurt someone. Cody looked at the wrench. He got up and hung it on the proper hook without defensiveness, which told Arthur something good about him. Mike watched this exchange and said nothing. They stood in the main bay afterward, the 3 of them. Arthur, Mike, clears throat, Victor, and the shop had the particular silence of a place that knows it's being evaluated. The parts room needs a full reorganization, Arthur said. Probably 2 days of work. The compressor is running 4 pSHA high, snorts, which over time affects your tool performance and your line fittings. The slow drain in Bay 2 will back up within a month if it's not cleared. He paused. The lifts look good. That's the most important thing. Bad lifts kill people. Mike was looking at him steadily. Cody's got good hands, Arthur continued. He needs someone to teach him to slow down at the right moments. That's not a criticism. That's 26 years old. Anything else? Mike asked. The office window was good. Previous manager liked to be able to see the floor. I like that too. Arthur put his hands in his jacket pockets. I'll take the job. The words came out of him with a quietness that surprised even him. Not a dramatic decision, not a moment of transformation, just a man looking at a thing that needed doing and saying yes. Victor, who had been leaning against the wall in the posture of a man who goes where Mike goes and observes what Mike observes and reports back when asked, made a sound that Arthur was choosing to interpret as approval. Mike put out his hand. Arthur shook it. Monday, Mike said. Monday, Arthur said. They were back at the trailer by 2:30, a full hour before Evan's bus. Arthur sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything he noted about the shop in the back of an envelope. Different envelope from the budget one. Though he used the budget one's empty back too, because he wanted to come in Monday with a list and a plan, and not the energy of a man who is starting over, but the energy of a man who is starting something. There's a difference. He'd learned that from Margaret too. Evan came home at 3:40 backpack, over one shoulder slightly later than usual. He came through the door and stopped when he saw Arthur at the table with papers in front of him, and an expression on his face that Evan apparently didn't immediately recognize. What happened? Evan said. Sit down, Arthur said. Evan sat down across from him. He put his backpack on the floor, and he looked at Arthur with those steady eyes that were his grandmother's, and he waited. Arthur told him everything. All of it. This time, the whole 2 days from the moment he'd seen the Harley on the shoulder of 155 to the handshake in the Bay of Roar and Sons 45 minutes ago, he told it straight. No softening, no editorial. Evan was 14. He'd been living the consequences of a situation without the full information, and he deserved the full information. Evan listened without interrupting. That was another thing about him. He didn't interrupt. He stored things up and processed them, and then responded when the whole picture was in front of him. When Arthur finished, Evan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, So, you don't have the janitor job anymore? No, but you have a different job. Starting Monday. Yes. Evan looked at the papers on the table. And the truck's getting fixed. It's being fixed right now, as far as I know. Another silence. Evan's fingers drummed once on the table lightly, and stopped. Is it real? He asked. Like, is it actually real? Because it sounds like he searched for the word. It sounds like a lot. I know it does, Arthur said. And I don't know how to prove to you it's real before Monday. I think you just have to watch it happen. Evan looked at him. Are you scared? Arthur thought about what he'd said to Danny Roar that morning. I'm scared of needing it. There's a difference. A little, he said. Evan nodded like this was the correct answer. Like if Arthur had said no, he would have been less sure. The guy, Evan said, Iron Mike. He tried the name out like he was checking its weight. What's he actually like? Arthur considered this. Honest, he said finally. Direct. The kind of man who does what he says and says what he means. I've met maybe a dozen people in my life who are genuinely like that. He paused. Your grandmother was one of them. Evan absorbed this, receiving his grandmother as a category that another person could belong to. Okay, he said, not dismissive, not overwhelmed, just landing it somewhere. Okay, then I think you should do it. I already shook his hand, Arthur said. Evan almost smiled. Good, he said. He picked up his backpack. Can we eat? I had half a sandwich for lunch because I gave the other half to Marcus because his mom forgot to pack his. Arthur looked at his grandson. Yeah, he said, we can eat. He made pasta because there was pasta and there was sauce, and there were things you could add to sauce to make it more than it was if you knew what you were doing, which Arthur did. They ate at the kitchen table, and Evan told him about Marcus, who was apparently going through a difficult stretch at home and had been quiet all week. And Arthur listened and thought about boys who go quiet when things are hard, and the different ways that manifests and what you can do about it, which is mostly just show up and be consistent. After dinner, Arthur's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. Mr. Collins, a woman's voice, professional, slightly formal, but not cold the way Harold Graves was cold. Warmer than that. Careful. My name is Patricia Albright. I'm the facilities director for Bakersfield Unified. Arthur sat down his coffee cup. I received a call today, she said, regarding your employment situation. I want you to know I've pulled your file and I've reviewed the record, and I've also had a conversation with Mr. Graves. She paused. I want to ask you directly, is the account I was given accurate that you were stranded on Highway 155 without phone access and unable to notify the district? That's accurate, Arthur said. And the reason you were stranded? Arthur was quiet for a moment. He was not going to lie. He was also not sure how much of the truth was his to give. I assisted a motorist who was stranded, he said. Used my emergency fuel to get them mobile. My truck ran dry shortly after. I see a pause. Not the pause of someone calculating. The pause of someone thinking, Mr. Collins. In 11 years with the district, your attendance record prior to 2 incidents this fiscal year was essentially spotless. Your performance reviews from Mr. Graves' predecessor were, he could hear paper. Excellent. Consistently excellent. Another pause. I'm going to be direct with you. The termination as filed does not sit right with me. What I'd like to do is rescind it and replace it with an unpaid personal day for the absence, which will go in your record, but will not constitute a terminable offense. Your badge and access will be reinstated Monday morning. Arthur stood up from the table. He walked to the kitchen window. He put one hand on the counter. He said, Miss Albright. Yes, thank you. Don't thank me, she said. 1 year of good work is its own argument. I just needed someone to make sure I looked at it. A brief pause. I understand you may be exploring other opportunities. That's your business, but your position is yours if you want it. Arthur stood at the window and thought about Monday, about Roar and Sons and Cody, and the torque wrench on the cart in the slow drain in Bay 2, about $6,000 a month in healthcare, and what Evan's face had looked like when he'd said, "Okay then, I think you should do it." He thought about Mike's handshake, the weight of it. "I appreciate that." He said, "I may need to let you know early next week about my plans." "Of course," she said. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Collins." The line went dead. Arthur set the phone on the counter and stood there for a long moment. The school district job was back. He could go back Monday morning badge and all Harold Graves or no Harold Graves and continue the life he'd had. The mop and the fluorescent bulbs and the task sheets and the tonight underlined and the $412 in the bank. He could do that, or he could walk into a shop on Baker Street and run 3 bays and teach a 26-year-old how to slow down at the right moments. He went to the doorway of the living room. Evan was on the couch with his homework spread across the cushions, pencil in his hand, reading something that required enough concentration that he didn't look up right away. "Evan Apar," Arthur said. Evan looked up. "The district job's back." They called and reversed the termination. Evan stared at him. "Seriously? Seriously?" Evan sat up straighter. "So now you have 2 jobs. I have a choice between 2 jobs." Evan put the pencil down. He looked at his grandfather with those measuring eyes. "The shop or the school?" "Yes." "More money at the shop? More than double health care?" "Yes." Evan was quiet for 5 full seconds, which when you are 14, and the answer seems obvious, is a very long time to be quiet. Then he said, "Grandpa, why is this a hard decision?" Arthur leaned against the doorframe. "Because I've been at the district 11 years. Because it's what I know. Because he stopped. Because it's safe," Evan said. Arthur looked at his grandson. "You always tell me," Evan said, "that you have to do things scared sometimes. That waiting for it to feel safe is how you wait your whole life." He picked the pencil back up, just saying. Arthur stood in the doorway of his living room and thought about all the times he'd said that to a 14-year-old boy, and how strange and fair it was that the 14-year-old boy was now saying it back. Saturday morning arrived the way significant mornings sometimes do, ordinary in its sounds, ordinary in its light, carrying nothing in its surface to indicate that it is different from any other morning. And then you step outside. Arthur heard them before he saw them. He was at the kitchen counter with his first cup of coffee when the rumble started. Lower than Friday snorts, fuller, the kind of sound that doesn't build gradually but arrives like weather. He went to the window. The street was not what it had been Friday. Friday had been 140 bikes, substantial and startling. What he was looking at now was of a different order entirely. They were coming from both ends of the street simultaneously, organized with a precision that spoke of coordination. Riders 2 and 3 abreast, filling the street the way water fills a channel, and they kept coming. His neighbors were out. Mrs. Pacheco on her porch again, this time with a cup of coffee of her own, resigned to the spectacle. The Morales family from 3 doors down, the 2 youngest kids pressed against their parents' legs wide-eyed. Old Mr. Tran from the corner house, standing at his chain-link fence with his hands in his pockets, watching with the calm attention of a man who has lived through enough history that new things don't easily unhinge him. 350 motorcycles is a number that is difficult to hold as an abstraction until you are watching it materialize on a residential street in Bakersfield, California, on a Saturday morning. Then it becomes very concrete. It has sound and mass and presence. It takes up the entire street and both curbs, and the sound of it dropping to idle, and then cutting is like something being punctuated. Arthur sat down his coffee. He got his jacket. He opened the door. Mike Roar was standing at the base of the steps. He was wearing the same cut, same patch, but he'd shaved, and something in his posture was different from a highway. Different from the kitchen, more formal in a way that wasn't stiff, ceremonial, without being theatrical. The posture of a man who understood that some moments had weight, and you should stand up straight in them. Behind him, 350 deep, the chapter stood with their bikes. And in front of Mike, parked directly in front of the trailer, clean in the morning light, was Arthur's truck. Not clean the way a wash truck is clean. Clean the way a thing is clean when it has been completely rebuilt and corrected and returned to what it should have been. The crack in the windshield was gone. The heater would not, Arthur knew, without yet turning the key, make that sound anymore. The rust on the body had been treated and primed. The tires were new. Every mechanical note Arthur had been carrying in the back of his mind for 2 years. The starter, the fuel gauge, the brake pull to the left, All of it had been erased. He stood on the steps and looked at his truck and could not immediately speak. Mike watched him. He let the silence exist without filling it. "You fixed the windshield," Arthur said finally. "It was not the most important thing, but it was what came out." "Couldn't see the crack from inside," Mike said. "But we knew it was there." Arthur came down the steps. He put his hand on the hood of the truck. The metal was cool and solid, and the dent above the front wheel well that had been there since a parking lot in 2019 was gone. "Mike," Arthur said. "There's more," Mike said. Arthur looked at him. Mike reached into his cut and took out an envelope. He held it out. Arthur didn't take it immediately. "What is it?" "Open it." Arthur took the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a document, several pages folded. He unfolded them. He was not a lawyer, and the language was not entirely clear, but certain things were clear. The name of the business, Rohr and Sons Auto, his name and ownership percentage numbers. He looked up. 30%. Mike said, "Sir, silent partnership to start until you've got your feet under you. Operational control is yours from Monday. The salary holds regardless." "But we wanted," he paused. "I wanted you to have something that was yours, not a job you could be fired from. Something yours." The street was very quiet for 350 bikes and the people who had come to watch. "I can't accept," Arthur started. "You can," Mike said. "Not aggressive. Absolute. We've got a lawyer who drew this up last night. It's clean. It's legal. It's done on our end. The only question is whether you sign it." Arthur looked at the document in his hands. He thought about Harold Graves and task sheets and 11 years of invisible labor. He thought about Patricia Albright saying, "Your position is yours if you want it," which was a kind thing to say, and also a different thing than what he was holding. He thought about Margaret, who had always believed the math could work. He thought about Evan asleep inside, who had said, "You always tell me you have to do things scared sometimes." Mike was watching him. 350 men were watching him. Mrs. Patch was watching him from her porch with her coffee held in both hands. Arthur looked up from the document. "You got a pen?" he said. Something moved across Mike Rohr's face. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that lives in the same neighborhood as relief and satisfaction, and the particular feeling of a story going the way it should. Victor produced a pen from somewhere. Of course he did. Arthur signed the document on the hood of his rebuilt truck on a Saturday morning in Bakersfield, California, with 350 witnesses and his neighbor watching in her house coat, and his grandson still asleep inside a leaking trailer that was for the first time in a long time a place that was going to be okay. He handed the document back to Mike. Mike took it, looked at it once, and folded it carefully back into the envelope. He put out his hand. Arthur shook it, and from somewhere in the 350 behind Mike, someone started it. A single horn, one bike, then 3, then 20, then the whole street was sound bikes coming to life. Not in a roar, but in something that had a rhythm to it. Something that felt less like noise and more like a statement. Like 350 men saying simultaneously and without ambiguity, "We see you. We know what you did, and you are not invisible anymore." Inside the trailer, a light came on in Evan's room. Evan came out of the trailer in his sleep clothes. He stood on the front step with his hair still flat on one side from the pillow, and his eyes adjusting to the morning and the full, impossible reality of 350 motorcycles on his street. And he looked at all of it, the bikes, the men, the rebuilt truck, the document envelope in Mike Rohr's hand. And then he looked at Arthur. Arthur looked back at him. "You signed it," Evan said. "I signed it." Evan stood there for a moment. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to control, which was unusual for him. And Arthur recognized it because he'd felt it himself 20 minutes ago and hadn't been able to name it then either. It was the feeling of something that had been braced against finally being allowed to stop bracing. The specific relief of a weight you'd carried so long. You'd stop registering it as weight until it was gone. Evan sat down on the step. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook once hard, and then he pulled it back. 14 years old, sitting on the front step of a leaking trailer in basketball shorts, trying not to cry in front of 350 strangers. Arthur went up the steps and sat down beside him. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on the back of Evan's neck the way his own father had done when Arthur was a boy and things were hard. That particular hold that says, "I'm here. I've got you. You don't have to carry this alone." He held it there. Evan didn't pull away. Mike Rohr stood at the base of the steps and watched this, and his jaw did the thing it had done on the highway, tightening holding. He looked away and gave them a moment that nobody asked him to give, but that he gave anyway, which told Arthur more about the man than anything he'd said in 3 days. After a minute, Evan straightened up. He rubbed his face with the back of his hand. He looked out at the street and said with the particular composure of someone who has decided to be composed, "That's a lot of bikes." 350, Arthur said. "They all came for you. They came because of a story Mike told them." Evan looked at Mike. Mike looked back at him without performance, without the slightly adjusted behavior adults sometimes produce when they become aware that a child is evaluating them. He just looked back steady and direct. "You're Iron Mike," Evan said. "That's right. My grandpa gave you his last gas." "He did." Evan was quiet for a moment. "Was your brother okay?" Mike's expression shifted in a way that was subtle and complete. "He's okay," he said. "He'll be okay." Evan nodded. He seemed to file this away as important. Then he said, "Thank you for fixing the truck." He said it simply without irony or performance, the way children say things when they mean them entirely. Mike said, "Thank you for sharing him." Evan looked at Arthur, not sure what to do with that. Arthur wasn't entirely sure either. They sat with it. The rest of Saturday moved in a way Arthur hadn't expected, not with ceremony and formality, but with something looser, more human. The chapter didn't leave immediately. Men found places to stand and talk. Some of them had brought food, actual food in coolers, and bags, the kind of quantity that materialized when you had a chapter of 350 coordinating logistics. Someone produced a folding table. Mrs. Pacheco came over from her porch and was immediately recruited into a conversation by a large man named Benny, who had an opinion about tamale that turned out to be quite informed. The Morales kids from 3 doors down stopped being pressed against their parents and started being given rides on the back of stationary bikes, supervised engines off, just sitting in the seat and feeling what it felt like to be that high off the ground. Arthur moved through all of it in a state that he would later describe to no one because he didn't have words for it yet. Not happiness exactly. Closer to rightness, the feeling of a thing being in the place it was supposed to be. Danny Rohr arrived at 11 o'clock driven by someone from the chapter because he wasn't cleared to drive yet. He came to where Arthur was standing near the truck and said, "You signed the papers." "I did." "Good." He extended his good hand. "Partners." Arthur shook it. "You're a partner, too. Mike put me in for 15%. Mostly to annoy me." He glanced at his brother across the yard. "He knows I hate owning things. I prefer to complain about how things are run without having any actual responsibility." "That's not going to work anymore," Arthur said. Danny grinned. It transformed his face entirely, made him look younger, less battered, more like the person he probably was before a drunk driver on the 99 had tried to reorganize his anatomy. "No," he said, "I guess it's not." It was during the ease of it, the ordinary human texture of a Saturday that had somehow grown from the wreckage of a Thursday night, that Mike found Arthur standing apart for a moment near his truck, hand on the fender, looking at it. "What are you thinking about?" Mike said. "A lot of things," Arthur said. "Which one's the loudest?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. "My daughter," he said. Mike waited. "Her name's Dana. She's in Los Angeles. I haven't talked to her in 8 months." Arthur kept his hand on the fender. "She lost herself a while back. Drugs. The kind of losing that happens in stages slowly, and then all at once, and by the time you see the whole shape of it, it's already been the whole shape for a long time." He paused. "She didn't lose Evan to me. She asked me to take him. That was the last time we talked. She called me, and she said, 'I can't do this right now. I can't be his mother right now.' And she asked me to take him, and I said, 'Yes.' And she said, 'Thank you.' And that was 8 months ago." Mike leaned against the truck, beside him. "She's still his mother," Arthur said. "And I don't know where she is right now. I don't know if she's safe. I've been afraid to find out because the answer might be one I can't handle, and I've been barely handling everything else." He paused. "But I'm not barely handling things anymore. So you're going to look?" Mike said, "I'm going to look." Mike was quiet for a moment. "Then we have people in Los Angeles. Not for anything like this. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we have people who know the city, who know where to look for someone who doesn't want to be found. And also might." He turned his head toward Arthur. "If you want help looking when you're ready." Arthur looked at him. "Why you keep doing that? What? Offer more?" Mike shrugged one shoulder. "Because there's Clear's throat, more to offer." He said it simply like it was obvious. And because he stopped, he looked out at the yard full of his men, and Evan handing a paper plate to Danny and Mrs. Pacheco, laughing at something Benny had said. "When I walked into that clubhouse Thursday night and told that story, I wasn't making a case for action. I needed to say it out loud. I needed someone else to know what you did." He paused and the room went quiet. Real quiet. And Big Lou, who is 64 years old and has been riding since before I was born, he stood up and said, "That man is family." Just like that. No vote, no discussion. Just that man is family. Mike looked at Arthur. You can't argue with Big Lou. Nobody argues with Big Lou. Arthur absorbed this being voted family by a room he'd never been in, by men he'd never met, because of a gas can on a dark highway. I don't know what to do with that, he said honestly. You don't have to do anything with it. Mike said, it just is. Monday came. Arthur Clear's throat was at Rohr and Sons at 7:15, 45 minutes before Cody arrived. He unlocked the shop with the key Mike had given him Saturday afternoon, and he stood in the empty bay, in the early morning quiet, and he looked at what was his. Not entirely his, 30% his, but 30% of something real was 300% more than what he'd had last week. He started with the parts room. He pulled everything off the shelves and sorted it on the floor of Bay 3 in categories. And by the time Cody came in at 8, Arthur had already built a reorganization system on paper and was starting to execute it. Cody stood in the doorway of the parts room and looked at the floor covered in organized parts and said, "Did you sleep here?" "I got here at 7:15. Arthur said, "It's 8 o'clock. I work fast when I know what I'm doing." Arthur handed him a list. "I need these bins labeled before any of this goes back on the shelves. Can you handle that?" Cody looked at the list, then at Arthur, then at the list again. "Yeah," he said. "Absolutely." The second mechanic, a man named Hector Vega, who was 38 years old and had 17 years of experience and the kind of quiet professional pride that shows in how a man cleans his tools, arrived at 8:30, looked at the parts room situation, and said to Cody, "New manager." Cody nodded. Hector nodded back and went to his bay without another word, which was the most efficient form of approval Arthur had ever received. By noon, 3 cars had come in for service. By 2, all 3 were done, and 2 more had been booked for Tuesday. By 4, the parts room was reorganized. The compressor was adjusted, and Arthur had cleared the drain in Bay 2 with a hand auger he'd found in the back of the utility cabinet. He sat in the office at 4:30 and looked through the window at the clean floor of the main bay and thought about Harold Graves and task sheets and tonight underlined, and he thought, I am never going back. Not with bitterness, just with clarity. He called Patricia Albright at 4:45. He got her voicemail. He left a message thanking her for the reversal and letting her know that he would not be returning to his position, that he appreciated 11 years with the district, and that he wished the department well. He said it cleanly, without drama, because it deserved to be said cleanly. He was walking to his truck, the rebuilt, windshield intact, correctly running truck, when his phone rang. Unknown number, California area code, Los Angeles. His hand tightened on the phone. He stood in the parking lot of his own shop, and he thought about what Mike had said. We have people in Los Angeles. He told Mike he wasn't ready yet, that he needed a week to get his footing before he could handle whatever the answer was. Mike had said, whenever you're ready. He'd been ready for about 6 hours, he answered. Silence on the other end. Not dead air-occupied silence. Someone there breathing. Dana, he said, a sound small, compressed, the sound of someone who has been holding something for a long time, and here's their name, said gently, and the hold slips. Daddy, her voice smaller than he remembered, which meant she was trying to control it. How did you? Why didn't she? Stopped, started over. Someone called me. A man named Victor. He said you were looking for me. He said her voice caught. He said you were okay. He said things were better. He said I should call. Arthur sat down on the running board of his truck. Where are you? He asked. I'm in a program, she said. I've been in it 6 weeks. It's the first one that's felt like it might actually. She stopped. I was going to call you when I had more time in because I didn't want to call and then have it fall apart and have you. She couldn't finish. Dana, Arthur said, listen to me, Dad. Listen. His voice was steady. He made it steady for her the way he'd made it steady for Evan on the steps. The way Margaret had made things steady for him for 31 years. You call me whenever you're ready. Not when you have proof. Not when it's certain. You call me now or you call me in a year, but you call me. You hear a long silence. Is Evan okay? She whispered. Evan is the best person I know, Arthur said. He made me coffee last week before school and left a note. He gave half his lunch to a kid whose mom forgot to pack it. He paused. He's going to want to talk to you when you're ready for that. Donna made a sound that was past language entirely, just sound. The sound of a person coming apart and coming together at the same time, which is what happens when you have been afraid of a door for so long, and then someone opens it, and it's not locked. They talked for 42 minutes. Arthur did not track the time. He sat on the running board of his truck in the parking lot of his shop, and he talked to his daughter for the first time in 8 months, and he did not push, and he did not demand, and he did not make her feel the weight of what had been lost, because he was 62 years old, and he understood that you don't rebuild by talking about the rubble. You rebuild by picking up the next thing and putting it somewhere useful. When they hung up, she said, "I'm going to call Evan." "When can I call him?" "Call him tonight." Arthur said 7 o'clock. "He'll be done with homework." Oh, pause. "You think he wants to hear from me?" "I know he does," Arthur said. He sat in the parking lot after the call ended and let the silence happen. The late afternoon was going gold the way it does in California in October. That specific slant of light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is, or maybe exactly as significant as it is. Arthur had never been sure which. He thought about Thursday night, for days ago, the highway and the cold, and the fuel can, and the sound of a Harley firing up and pulling away into the dark. He thought about the mathematics of it, the chain of it. One decision at 3 o'clock in the morning made by a man with $412 and a bad knee and 7 miles to walk, and what that decision had become by Monday afternoon. A shop, a truck, a partnership, a daughter on the phone, a grandson who would get a call at 7 o'clock tonight that had the potential to rearrange something fundamental in his understanding of family. He thought about Margaret. He thought about her voice, clear and specific in his memory. Nobody makes it through the dark alone, Arthur. Nobody. He started the truck. The engine turned over clean and immediate. No hesitation. The starter doing exactly what a starter is supposed to do. The heater came on quiet. The fuel gauge, fixed working, showed 3/4 of a tank. He pulled out of the lot. At 7 o'clock that evening, Arthur sat at the kitchen table and listened to Evan's voice change on the phone. Snorts, listened to his grandson go from guarded to tentative to something that was not yet fully open, but was facing in the right direction, which is all you can ask of a thing that has been closed a long time. He listened to Evan say, "Are you coming back?" and listened to Dana say, "I'm working on it. I'm working on it every day." And he listened to Evan say in the voice of a 14-year-old boy who has learned not to ask for things, but is asking for this one. Okay. Keep working on it." After the call, Evan came to the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment without speaking. "You knew," he said. "I hoped," Arthur said. Victor made a call. Evan came and sat down at the table. He looked at his hands. "She sounded different," he said, "from how I remembered." Different how Evan thought about it. Like herself, he said, finally more like herself. Arthur looked at his grandson across the kitchen table in the trailer that was leaking less now that someone had looked at the roof seal Mike's guy Saturday while Arthur hadn't been watching. And he could clear his throat, thought about what a man leaves behind when he goes. Not money, not property, not the truck. Oh, not the truck or the shop or the 30% or any of the tangible things. What a man leaves behind is the example of how he moved through the world. Whether he stopped or drove past, whether he turned the truck around, whether at 3 o'clock in the morning on a dark stretch of highway with $412 to his name, he poured his last gallon into a stranger's tank and said, "Get to that hospital. Go, don't be late like I was." Arthur Collins had been invisible for a long time. Invisible to the district, to Harold Graves, and his task sheets to the neighbors who drove past him on the highway and didn't slow down. Invisible. The way people become invisible when they do good work quietly and ask for nothing and expect nothing and keep showing up regardless. He was not invisible anymore. Not because 350 motorcycles had filled his street. Not because his name was on a business document. Not because a facilities director had reversed a termination or a woman in a recovery program in Los Angeles had finally called. He was not invisible because a 14-year-old boy looked at him across a kitchen table and knew exactly who he was. And in the end, that was the only audience that had ever mattered. Arthur Collins poured his last gallon for a stranger in the dark, walked 7 miles home in the cold, and lost everything he had. And in losing it finally completely, and without apology, found everything he